Our Supreme Commander Varax stood at the crossroads of galactic history and felt the weight of his decision pressing against his carapace like the crushing pressure of a world he could not escape. His admirals urged immediate attack, arguing that the hegemony could not show weakness before a species it had dismissed as primitive. But the debris of Probe Squadron 7 still drifted across his tactical display as a silent reminder of what such aggression would cost. His intelligence officers counseled retreat and regrouping, recommending that he return to hegemony space and report what he had discovered so that a larger fleet could be assembled. But he knew that every moment he delayed would allow the broadcast of Earth's defiance to spread further across the galaxy, and across that galaxy, the fire that Ambassador Yoon had ignited was already beginning to burn on the hegemony subject world of Kellara Prime. Millions of workers who had spent generations building ships for their conquerors watched the footage of human weapons tearing through hegemony vessels, and they began to whisper to each other about possibilities they had never dared to consider. On Veth colonies scattered across a dozen star systems, survivors of a proud civilization that had been broken by hegemony conquest saw their shield technology turned against their oppressors, and they wept with a mixture of grief and fierce satisfaction on 100 other worlds, where species lived under the hegemony's shadow. Beings who had long ago accepted their subjugation as permanent and inevitable began to look up at the stars and wonder if perhaps they had been wrong. Vorax received reports from across hegemony territory, describing demonstrations and work stoppages and the first tentative demands for independence. And he understood that humanity had wounded the hegemony in a way that no fleet battle ever could. They had proven that the hegemony could be defied. Supreme Commander, his communications officer, announced, "We are receiving transmissions from multiple hegemony subject worlds requesting clarification on the footage being broadcast from this system." Varax did not respond because he was watching Ambassador Yoon, who had remained silent on the view screen while he considered his options. Her expression patient and her posture relaxed in a way that suggested she already knew what his decision would be. "What happens if I leave?" he asked finally, his voice quiet enough that only those closest to him could hear. Yoon's response was broadcast across the galaxy. "If you leave in peace, Earth will not pursue you," she said, "but we will not hide any longer, and we will make an offer to every world in this galaxy that has lived under the hegemony's shadow." She stepped forward, and her voice grew stronger, carrying conviction that could not be faked. "Earth offers protection to any world that wants it," she declared. "Freedom to any species under hegemony control, and a simple promise that we will enforce with everything we have built." She paused and looked directly into the visual pickup. "No one will be forced to kneel again." The words spread across communication networks and were repeated in languages that humans had never heard. Translated and shared and whispered in places where the hegemony had believed its control was absolute. Varax saw his empire beginning to crumble on the tactical display, not through military defeat, but through something far more dangerous: the death of the fear that had held it together for millennia. "This is not over," he said. But even he could hear the hollow uncertainty in his own words. "No," Ambassador Yoon agreed. "It is just beginning." The hegemony fleet withdrew from the Sol system 12 hours later, leaving behind only the debris of the ships that had been destroyed in those 14 seconds of demonstration. And humanity watched them go with relief and determination, and they acknowledged that the hard work was only starting in the months that followed. The galaxy transformed in ways that historians would debate for centuries. Subject worlds declared independence one after another, and when hegemony forces moved to suppress them, they found human ships waiting, not attacking but simply present as a reminder of what would happen if the hegemony escalated. Earth did not seek to conquer or to build its own empire, instead offering alliance and protection to any world that asked while demanding nothing in return. accept a commitment to never force another species to submit the old order of the galaxy, built on fear and dominance and the assumption that might made right, began to dissolve like ice beneath a warming sun. Admiral Kang Min-jae retired to a small house on the coast of Korea, where he spent his days fishing and trying to forget the terrible weapons he had commanded. And he often wondered if the peace they had achieved was worth the destruction he had been prepared to unleash. Ambassador Yoon became the first leader of the Galactic Commonwealth, a voluntary alliance of species that chose to work together rather than dominate each other. And she spent the rest of her life building something that had never existed before in galactic history. And Earth, once dismissed as an insignificant backwater populated by a primitive species that posed no threat to anyone, became the guardian of galactic peace, not through conquest but by making itself too dangerous to challenge and too principled to fear. Children on 1,000 worlds grew up hearing stories of the humans, the species that had hidden in plain sight for 30 years while building an arsenal that could challenge the greatest empire the galaxy had ever known, and then had used that arsenal not to conquer, but to protect. Some called them heroes, and some called them dangerous, and some called them the greatest bluff in the history of intelligent life. But everyone agreed on one thing: humanity had changed the galaxy forever in the end. Earth's greatest weapon had never been the railguns, or the energy beams, or the drone swarms, or the mysterious technology that disrupted hegemony shields. Earth's greatest weapon had been patience and preparation, and the stubborn refusal to become what the galaxy expected. The hegemony had come to Seoul, expecting to find sheep they had discovered wolves, and the galaxy would never forget the lesson that humanity taught them in those 14 seconds of fire and light, that the meek do not inherit the stars, the prepared do. The silence that followed Ambassador Yoon's words stretched across the bridge of the hegemony flagship like a physical weight, and Supreme Commander Varax found himself facing a moment that no hegemony commander had experienced in over 1,000 years of galactic dominance. His admirals and officers looked to him for guidance, but for once he had none to give, and the tactical display before him showed a reality that contradicted everything he had believed about humanity and about the natural order of the galaxy. How is this possible? His chief intelligence officer whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. We have been monitoring Earth for 30 years, and we saw nothing that suggested capabilities like this. Ambassador Yoon heard the question through the still open communication channel, and she stepped forward with an expression that mixed sadness with determination. Perhaps it is time that we explain, she said, not just to you, Supreme Commander, but to everyone in the galaxy who was watching this confrontation. She gestured, and the view behind her changed to show a historical display. Images and data that told a story that humanity had kept secret for 3 decades. When we first made contact with alien life, we were filled with wonder and hope. Yoon began, her voice carrying across the communication networks to every ship in the hegemony fleet and beyond to the countless observers who were monitoring the confrontation. We imagined joining a community of peaceful civilizations, working together to explore the mysteries of the universe. The display showed records of early diplomatic contacts, meetings where human representatives had smiled and offered friendship to beings from distant stars. But what we found was very different from what we hoped for. Yoon continued, we found a galaxy ruled by predators, where the strong dominated the weak, and where species that refused to fight were inevitably conquered, enslaved, or exterminated. Images appeared showing the fates of peaceful civilizations that had tried to coexist with the hegemony. Worlds that had been stripped of resources and populations that had been scattered across the galaxy as laborers and servants. We studied your history, Supreme Commander, and we saw the pattern that repeated again and again, Yoon said. Every species that relied on diplomacy alone eventually fell. and every species that showed weakness was treated as prey by those who had the strength to take what they wanted. Varax wanted to deny her words, but he could not, because everything she described was simply the way the galaxy had always worked. The natural order that the hegemony had enforced for millennia. So we made a choice, Yoon continued. We would smile and trade and accept refugees and pretend to be exactly what the galaxy expected us to be. A harmless species stumbling through the early stages of space travel. While secretly, we prepared for the day that we knew would eventually come. The display changed again to show the construction of humanity's hidden arsenal. Time-lapse images of weapons platforms being built inside mountains and fleets being assembled in the darkness between stars. We did not want to fight, Yoon said. And there was genuine regret in her voice. We wanted to make fighting us unthinkable. To build such overwhelming defensive capability that no rational enemy would ever consider attacking us. She paused and looked directly at Varax, but we did not do this alone. The display showed something that made Varax's compound eyes widen in sudden understanding. Images of refugees from dozens of species that had fled hegemony territory over the past 30 years. Beings who had been welcomed on Earth and given new homes among humanity. Every species you conquered. Every world you subjugated. Every people you scattered across the galaxy. Some of them found their way to Earth, Yoon explained. And they shared everything they knew about hegemony tactics, technology, weaknesses, and secrets. Scientists from species the hegemony had dismissed as defeated explained principles of physics that human researchers had never considered. And engineers who had fled oppression helped design weapons that combined alien knowledge with human creativity in ways that neither could have achieved alone. Your shield technology was developed by the Veth before you conquered them, Yoon continued. And it was a Veth refugee who explained to us how those shields worked and how they might be disrupted. She gestured at the debris field that had once been Probe Squadron 7. Your armor specifications were memorized by Kelleran, engineers who you forced to build ships for your fleets. And when they escaped to Earth, they brought that knowledge with them. The tactical display on Varax's bridge suddenly looked very different as he realized how completely human intelligence had penetrated. Hegemony secrets, every species you bullied, every people you oppressed, every civilization you thought you had broken. They contributed something to what you just witnessed, Yoon said. Humanity's secret weapon was never just our technology. It was 30 years of preparation guided by the collective knowledge and burning resentment of the galaxy's oppressed. Across the galaxy, beings who had suffered under hegemony rule watched the broadcast with tears in their eyes, finally understanding that their scattered knowledge and whispered secrets had not been lost but had instead been gathered and forged into a weapon that could challenge their oppressors on worlds where hegemony governors ruled with absolute authority. Populations began to gather in public spaces, sharing the broadcast and looking at each other with something they had not felt in generations. Hope Varax saw the implications spreading across his tactical display as reports came in from hegemony territory, showing unrest and demonstrations and the first signs of a fire that might spread beyond anyone's ability to control. "What do you want?" he asked finally, his voice carrying none of the arrogance it had held when he first arrived in the Sol system. Ambassador Yoon's expression softened slightly, though her resolve remained absolute. "We want what every species in this galaxy deserves," she said. "The right to exist without fear, to grow without being conquered, to reach for the stars without being pushed back down by those who came before us." She paused and looked at the Supreme Commander with something that might have been compassion. "We are offering you a choice. Varax, one that the hegemony has never offered to anyone else." "What choice?" he asked. "You can leave this system in peace and return to your masters with the truth about what you found here. Yoon said. Or, you can attack and learn just how much we have been holding back. The weight of the decision pressed down on Vorax like the gravity of a gas giant. And he knew that whatever he chose in this moment would echo across the galaxy for generations to come. Supreme Commander Vorax refused to show weakness before his officers, and he responded to Ambassador Yoon's challenge with the fury that had served him well in 100 campaigns against lesser species. You dare threaten the hegemony with your hidden toys, he snarled through his translator. Then let us see what your primitive weapons can do against ships that have conquered 1,000 worlds. He turned to his tactical officer and issued the order that he believed would expose human bravado for the bluff it must surely be. Send Probe Squadron 7 forward to test their defenses, he commanded. 37 ships should be more than enough to show these humans the difference between hiding weapons and knowing how to use them. The squadron of hegemony warships broke formation and accelerated toward the nearest cluster of human defense platforms, their commanders confident that their superior shields and battle-tested tactics would easily overcome whatever resistance they encountered. Admiral Kang watched the approaching ships on his tactical display and felt no satisfaction in what he was about to do. Only the grim necessity that had driven humanity's preparations for 3 decades. Weapons stations confirm targeting solutions, he ordered quietly. And may we be forgiven for what we must do to survive. Across the human defensive network, weapons systems that existed nowhere in the hegemony's databases locked onto the incoming squadron. And gunners who had trained for years in secret took careful aim at ships whose specifications they had memorized from intelligence gathered by grateful refugees. All stations report ready. The weapons officer announced. Kang closed his eyes for a single heartbeat and then spoke. The word that would change the galaxy forever. Fire. What happened next would be studied by military analysts across the galaxy for generations. And the recordings of those 14 seconds would become the most viewed footage in the history of interstellar warfare. The first wave of human weapons were railguns that fired projectiles at velocities that the hegemony had long ago dismissed as impossible to achieve. And these hypervelocity rounds struck the incoming ships before their sensors could even register. The launch hegemony shields were designed to deflect energy weapons and absorb the impact of conventional projectiles. But they had never encountered objects moving at a significant fraction of the speed of light. And the kinetic energy released when these rounds struck was beyond anything the shield generators could handle. 7 ships died in the first 3 seconds. Their hulls torn apart by impacts that transferred more energy than nuclear explosions. And the debris from their destruction became secondary projectiles that damaged the ships around them before the surviving commanders could even process what had happened. The second wave of human weapons activated. And this was something that hegemony scientists would later describe as theoretically impossible. Directed energy beams powered by contained antimatter annihilation swept across the squadron, each beam carrying enough power to slice through hegemony armor like a hot knife through soft butter. And the precision of these weapons was such that they could target specific systems on enemy ships rather than simply destroying them outright. Engines exploded and weapons arrays melted and sensor domes vaporized as the human gunners demonstrated a level of accuracy that should not have been achievable at such distances. And 15 more ships became drifting hulks in the span of 4 seconds. The remaining ships attempted to scatter and retreat, their commanders screaming orders that their crews were too shocked to obey effectively. But they had already entered the range of humanity's third weapon system. Drone swarms numbering in the millions emerged from hidden launchers and converged on the fleeing ships with a coordination that revealed artificial intelligence far beyond what the hegemony believed humans possessed. and each tiny drone carried a shaped charge designed to penetrate armor at its weakest points. The drones did not attack randomly, but instead worked together like a single organism with millions of bodies, identifying vulnerable spots on each ship and striking in coordinated waves that overwhelmed point defense systems that were never designed to track so many small, fast-moving targets, but it was the fourth weapon that truly terrified the hegemony officers who watched from the safety of the main fleet, because this weapon did something that their scientists would later insist was completely impossible. The shields on the remaining hegemony ships simply stopped working. There was no visible beam or projectile, no energy signature that sensors could detect. Just a sudden and complete failure of defensive systems that had been functioning perfectly moments before. What did they do? Vorax demanded as he watched the last ships of Probe Squadron 7 die under the combined assault of weapons they could not understand and defenses they could not penetrate. His science officer stared at the readings with a non-expression of pure incomprehension. "I do not know, Supreme Commander," he admitted. "Our shields operate on principles of quantum field manipulation that have been proven reliable for 10,000 years. But the humans have somehow found a way to disrupt those fields at a fundamental level. In exactly 14 seconds, 37 hegemony warships had been reduced to expanding clouds of debris, and not a single human ship had needed to leave its defensive position to achieve this result." The footage of the battle spread across the galaxy within hours, transmitted by hegemony ships to their homeworlds and intercepted by neutral observers who shared it with everyone who had ever wondered what would happen if someone finally stood up to the galactic hegemony on 100 worlds where species lived under hegemony domination. Beings who had long ago given up hope watched the recording again and again, unable to believe what they were seeing on the bridge of his flagship. Vorax stood in silence as his officers waited for orders that he could not bring himself to give. And for the first time in his long career of conquest, he faced an enemy that he was not certain he could defeat. Ambassador Yoon's face appeared on the view screen once more, and when she spoke, her voice carried no triumph or satisfaction, only the weary resolve of someone who had hoped this day would never come. "That was a demonstration," she said simply. "And we have many more weapons that we have not yet revealed." She paused and looked directly into the visual pickup, as if she could see through it to meet Vorax's compound eyes. "Now, Supreme Commander, are you ready to discuss terms as equals? Or do you require further convincing?" 60 hours into the waiting period, the sensor officers aboard the hegemony flagship began to notice anomalies that they could not explain, and their confusion quickly turned to alarm as readings that had been stable for days suddenly began to change in ways that defied everything they understood about the human solar system. "Supreme Commander," the chief sensor officer reported with obvious uncertainty in his voice, "we are detecting energy signatures emerging from locations that our scans showed as empty rock and barren terrain." Vorax turned his compound eyes toward the tactical display and watched as dozens of new contacts appeared where moments before there had been nothing. Then hundreds, then thousands, until the screen was filled with markers that represented ships and weapons platforms that should not exist. "That is impossible," one of his admirals declared. "We scanned this entire system when we arrived, and there was nothing there but asteroids and ice, and the primitive human installations that posed no threat to us. But the evidence before them told a different story." And as the hegemony officers watched in growing disbelief, the scale of what they were witnessing became terrifyingly clear on the surface of Earth. Mountains that had stood unchanged for millions of years began to split open along hidden seams, revealing vast hangars carved into the living rock where fleets of warships waited in perfect formation, and the roar of engines coming to life echoed across valleys and plains as humanity's hidden forces rose into the sky. the oceans churned. As platforms that had been resting on the seabed for decades emerged from the depths, bristling with weapons that gleamed in the sunlight, and coastal populations who had never known what lay beneath the waves watched in awe as their protectors finally revealed themselves on the moon, the dark side that had always faced away from. Prying alien eyes transformed before the hegemony's sensors, as enormous structures that had been buried beneath the lunar surface pushed upward through the regolith and extended weapons arrays that dwarfed anything in the invading fleet. Admiral Kang Minjae stood in the command center of humanity's primary battle station, hidden within what the hegemony had classified as an unremarkable asteroid in the belt between Mars and Jupiter. And he watched the reports flowing in from every hidden installation with a mixture of pride and solemn purpose. All defensive networks report full operational status, his executive officer announced, and fleet elements are achieving combat readiness ahead of schedule. Kang nodded and turned to the holographic display that showed the true extent of Earth's military power, the result of 30 years of secret construction and development that had remained hidden from the finest intelligence networks in the galaxy. How did they miss all of this? One of the younger officers wondered aloud, and Kang allowed himself a slight smile before answering. They missed it because we wanted them to miss it, he explained, and because they believed what they expected to believe about a species they considered primitive and harmless. The plan had been conceived in the earliest days of first contact, when humanity's leaders realized that the galaxy operated on principles of naked power and that peaceful species survived only at the pleasure of their more aggressive neighbors. Earth had publicly maintained only a token military force, just enough to appear credible as a minor spacefaring civilization, while secretly channeling vast resources into hidden construction projects that used every technique of concealment that human ingenuity could devise. The ships that now emerged from their hiding places had been built in sections at separate facilities and assembled in the darkness of space, their hulls coated with materials that absorbed sensor signals and their power systems designed to remain dormant until the moment of activation. The weapons platforms hidden beneath cities and mountains had been constructed during legitimate building projects, disguised as foundations and support structures that no alien observer would think to examine closely, and the crews who would operate them had trained in complete secrecy for years. Send the message to the hegemony fleet, Tang ordered, and communications officers across the system prepared to deliver humanity's response to the ultimatum that had been issued 72 hours before on the bridge of his flagship. Varax stared at the tactical display with all 6 of his limbs frozen in a posture of shock that his species only displayed when facing something beyond their comprehension. And around him, his officers whispered to each other in tones of barely controlled panic. Supreme Commander, his communications officer announced, "We are receiving a transmission from Earth." The face of Ambassador Yoon appeared on the view screen once again, but this time she stood in what was clearly a military command center rather than a diplomatic office, surrounded by officers in uniforms that bore no resemblance to anything the hegemony had seen from humanity before Supreme Commander Varax. She began, her voice carrying absolute confidence that had been absent from their previous conversation. "Earth has prepared its response to your ultimatum, and we are now ready to discuss terms." Behind her, display showed the full scope of humanity's revealed arsenal. Thousands of warships and tens of thousands of weapons platforms and defensive installations that covered the entire solar system in overlapping fields of fire. "You came here with 3,000 ships and believed that would be enough to force our submission," Yoon continued. "But as you can now see, we have been preparing for this moment since the day we learned what kind of galaxy we live in." Varax found his voice at last and leaned forward with fury building in his compound eyes. "This changes nothing," he declared, though his voice lacked the certainty it had carried before. "The hegemony commands resources beyond anything you can imagine, And even if you have hidden some ships and weapons, you cannot hope to stand against the full might of our empire." Ambassador Yoon's expression did not change, but something in her eyes made Varax feel a chill that his species rarely experienced. "Perhaps you were right," she said calmly, "but before you make any decisions about how to proceed, we would like to offer a small demonstration of what our weapons can do." She paused and glanced at someone off-screen before returning her gaze to the FD. "Supreme Commander, I suggest you choose which of your ships you can afford to lose." The war fleet of the Galactic Hegemony emerged from hyperspace like a swarm of metal locusts descending upon a field of wheat. And the people of Earth watched with a mixture of fear and quiet determination as 3,000 alien warships took position around their planet. Supreme Commander Varax stood on the bridge of his flagship, his insectoid body towering nearly 3 meters tall, his compound eyes reflecting the blue and green sphere that hung in the darkness before him. And he felt nothing but contempt for the primitive world that had dared to remain neutral in galactic affairs for 30 long years. "Open a channel to the human government," Varax commanded, his voice clicking and buzzing through his translator device. And within moments, the face of Ambassador Yoon Seo-jin appeared on the massive view screen, her expression calm and unreadable in a way that irritated the Supreme Commander. "Earth has been patient with your independence," Varax began, not bothering with diplomatic pleasantries. "But the Galactic Hegemony has decided that your neutrality is no longer acceptable, and you will submit to integration into our empire, or face the consequences that every other defiant world has faced." Ambassador Yoon listened without interrupting, her dark eyes studying the alien commander with an intensity that made several of his officers shift uncomfortably at their stations. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried no trace of the fear that Varax expected. "Supreme Commander, Earth appreciates the hegemony taking the time to deliver this message in person," she said, her tone polite but carrying an edge of something that Varax could not quite identify. "And we request 72 hours to prepare our official response to your generous offer." Varax made a sound that his translator rendered as harsh laughter, and he leaned forward in his command chair with all 6 of his limbs folding in a gesture of amusement that his species used when dealing with inferior beings. "You wish to delay so that you might find some way to escape your fate," he said. "But I will grant your request because it will change nothing. And in 72 hours, you will kneel before the hegemony, or your cities will burn as so many others have burned before them." The transmission ended and Ambassador Yoon turned to face the gathered leaders of Earth who had assembled in the emergency bunker beneath the Swiss Alps, their faces showing the strain of the moment that humanity had been preparing for since first contact 3 decades ago. "It has begun," she said simply. And around the room, men and women who had kept the greatest secret in human history began to nod with grim resolve. General Park Ji-hoon, the eldest of Earth's military commanders, rose from his seat and activated a holographic display that showed the planet and the enemy fleet surrounding it. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 30 years of careful planning. "The hegemony believes we are defenseless because that is what we wanted them to believe," he said. "And every intelligence report they have gathered, every scan they have conducted, every spy they have planted among us has told them exactly what we needed them to hear." The display changed to show a network of hidden installations spanning the entire solar system, thousands of weapons platforms, and ships and defensive stations that had been constructed in absolute secrecy while Earth pretended to be nothing more than a minor trading partner in galactic affairs. When humanity first made contact with alien life, we were filled with hope, Ambassador Yoon said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. But what we found was a galaxy ruled by predators, where the strong devoured the weak and peaceful species were enslaved or exterminated without mercy. She paused and looked at the faces around her, seeing the same understanding that had driven Earth's leaders for 3 decades. The knowledge that survival required more than good intentions and diplomatic skill. We studied galactic history, and we saw the pattern that no one else seemed willing to acknowledge. She continued, and we realized that if humanity wanted to survive, we would need to become something that the galaxy had never seen before. In orbit above Earth, Thorax received reports from his intelligence officers that confirmed everything the Thorax received reports from his intelligence officers that confirmed everything the officers that confirmed everything that hegemony believed about the human homeworld, showing a planet with minimal orbital defenses and a small fleet of outdated vessels that pose no threat to his armada. These humans are even more primitive than we anticipated, one of his advisors reported, and their military capabilities are laughable compared to even the weakest hegemony member world. Thorax nodded with satisfaction and began planning the occupation that would follow humanity's inevitable surrender, already imagining how he would be celebrated when he returned home with another species added to the hegemony's collection of subjects, but deep beneath the surface of Earth, and hidden within hollowed asteroids and concealed behind the dark side of the moon. Humanity's true military stirred to life as Admiral Cam Minjay received the order he had been waiting for his entire career. All units begin activation sequence. He commanded from his hidden command center. And may whatever gods watch over humanity forgive us for what we are about to reveal. Across the solar system, power cores that had been dormant for years began to hum with energy, and weapon systems that existed nowhere in the hegemony's intelligence databases came online, one by one like the eyes of ancient giants. Awakening from a long slumber, the 72 hours that Thorax had granted were not a delay tactic as he believed, but rather the time humanity needed to bring its full arsenal to readiness. And when the deadline arrived, the galaxy would learn that Earth had never been the helpless world it pretended to be. Ambassador Yoon stood at the window of her office and looked up at the stars that were blocked by the silhouettes of enemy warships. And she allowed herself a small smile that held no warmth. "You came here expecting to find sheep," she whispered to the fleet that could not hear her. "But you are about to discover that you have surrounded a world of wolves who have been sharpening their teeth in the darkness for 30 years. The countdown had begun, and nothing in the galaxy would ever be the same again."